We're speaking today with Dr. Ofer Levy, Director of the Precision Vaccine Program and Director of Infectious Diseases at Boston Children's Hospital. He's Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and is an associate member of the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard.
Dr. Levy is a member of the FDA's COVID vaccine advisory panel, which just issued recommendations for vaccine booster shots for certain populations. And his team is one of many that's worked on versions of the COVID-19 vaccine. Dr. Levy, welcome to Conversations on Healthcare.
A pleasure to be here, Margaret. Thank you.
Great. And Dr. Levy, you serve on the FDA COVID vaccine advisory panel, which has been in the news. Your expertise is in that pediatric immune responses and precision vaccine development. It was looking like that the 5 to 11-year-olds were back on track to be approved for emergency use authorization of the Pfizer vaccine by Halloween, but some say now it may not be until Thanksgiving. So far, it doesn't look that your panel has had a look at the Pfizer data to make your recommendations. Maybe tell our listeners what the timeline looks like to you on the vaccine authorization for younger children.
Thank you for that, Mark. This is a very important question. We face an unprecedented pandemic. We're very fortunate that the mRNA and other technologies had matured to the point that they were ready to be deployed against this threat. We're fortunate that we have safe and effective vaccines. And yet, individuals vary in their immune response, in their physiology, and we cannot assume that data in one age group applies exactly the same way to another age group. In fact, we've seen those differences just in terms of how the infection is operating. It's hitting the elderly particularly hard, older adults with higher rates of mortality, et cetera. When we convened as an advisory committee recently, we were asked an initial question by FDA of whether we would recommend a booster or third dose of the Pfizer mRNA product for individuals 16 years of age and up. And that first question got voted down by a pretty large margin. Mm-hmm. I forget the numbers. Maybe it was 17-4 against or something along those lines. I was one of the votes against. And the reason was that I can't speak for the other members, but from the conversation, what emerged was, most of us felt there was not enough safety information for the booster dose, particularly in the younger age groups. So then after some discussion, we rephrased the question for 65 years and up and those at risk of severe COVID. And that overwhelmingly passed. I think it was by consensus, 100% vote. And then we believe we might get there for younger age groups, but we need to see the data. And the sponsor, I believe, will be back, in this case, Pfizer, with more data in younger age groups for safety and efficacy. And then, we're going to call it as we see it. I can't prejudge any data I haven't seen yet. I do think it's important for the studies to be done.
Well, Dr. Levy, you've made the point that all of us as parents and healthcare people know that children are not just little adults, right? And you certainly want to make sure that we have the protocols for testing and determining safety and efficacy of these vaccines for younger children. But for our audience, maybe just talk a little bit, besides settling on what's the proper dose, what are the added risk factors unique to younger children and vaccines, the additional worries or concerns? We know that parents will be wanting reassurances. What kind of reassurances are we looking to be able to offer to parents that vaccines will, one, be effective, but most of all, that they'll be safe?
Well, I think the message to parents and to all Americans is that we have to let the process take its course. We have a good process in the United States through the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. The sponsors, whether they are Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, or other companies that have coronavirus vaccines, submit data to the FDA. Pfizer has announced that they have generated data in children 5 to 11 years of age. And to Pfizer's point of view, I just know this from reading the media, as anybody else is reading it, they believe those data indicate safety and efficacy in that age group. That's welcome news, but we need to take an independent stance. We have to see those data and review them. Vaccines you give to healthy people, so they've got to be safe. Safety comes first. We don't presume because it's safe in one age group that it's safe in another. And so we're going to take a very careful eye to the data. We have to let the process take its course. It's a good process. It's a public deliberation. The members of the committee are not allowed to meet in closed session. We're not even allowed to email each other about the topic. Everything we transact, any information we discuss is in public and on the record. And there's public commentary phase as well for any American of any point of view to express themselves. So we believe that's a good process. I look forward when the time comes to review those data. I haven't seen them yet. And I look forward to a very open and frank conversation among the committee members with FDA and with the sponsor. And we will have to come to the best decision based on the information available. Even once a product is authorized or approved, and I'm not prejudging anything for the next meeting, but even when a vaccine is authorized or approved, safety concerns continue to, we continue to keep an eye on safety. We have surveillance systems. The FDA, the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, have safety surveillance. Some of you may know the vSafe app. When you got immunized, you could opt in on your iPhone and you answer surveys about safety. So if any signals are detected, we have seen entire programs shut down, making the news, right, with the J&J, AstraZeneca. Right. Shut down, even with very rare cases. So I believe the public should look at all of that and say the system is working. We're taking safety very seriously.
I want to pull the thread on the process in the system, and wondering if at some point there will be a retrospective look at what do we do in a global pandemic. I think you're absolutely right, and I think everybody would agree. The very staid process the FDA has been a great one, served us well in our country. But as you think about lethality and transmissibility being much greater, one hopes that never happens. Do you think that there is a different process that the FDA might consider as it looks out into the future? Because we certainly have to prep for these types of global pandemics to continue, not bury our head in the sand. So what's your sense about that retrospective analysis? That should it be done? Are people thinking about it now? What's your own view on it?
Well, that's a complex question. I mean, we want to be rigorous and we want to put safety first, and we want a system that can respond efficiently to challenging circumstances like a pandemic. That's the whole basis of the authorization, right? The authorization is short of a full approval and moved forward pretty rapidly. If that was a standard approval process for the initial Pfizer vaccine, I'm talking now a year back, that would have taken a lot longer. So we went with about 2 to 3 months of follow-up data for the safety, reasoning at that point that the pandemic was killing a lot of people, and that to the extent that vaccines have side effects, they're reported in the first days and weeks after a shot. There are no medically proven side effects that mysteriously arise many months later or years later after a vaccine, just in general, looking at all vaccines. And so that was the basis for deciding on 2 to 3 months of follow-up safety data. Beyond that, once the sponsor submits the data to FDA, FDA understandably needs some time to look at it. These are complex data sets. They have to be looked at statistically. They have to double check all the definitions and how the data are put together. And then that has to be packaged for the advisory committee, et cetera. Are there steps there that could be even faster? I don't know, maybe, but we've got to keep safety first and we've got to keep the integrity of the process. If we push it too hard, then we have cutting corners, and that would not be wise in my mind, because the public wants to know we're taking the safety very seriously. And if we make a mistake, that can have very negative consequences, not just during the current pandemic, but just in the general confidence in the vaccine enterprise. So the calculus around this is delicate, and I think the system has done a pretty good job under the circumstances.
Well, I agree. And I have to say, I can't think of a single day since March of 2020 when COVID vaccine, COVID testing wasn't on the front page of the newspaper. So the whole country has had kind of an education in how this whole pandemic has unfolded and our strategies to control it. and to treat it in people who are infected. And certainly when the FDA Vaccine Advisory Panel issued a ruling on COVID vaccine boosters for the general public and recommending boosters for people 65 and over and those with underlying health conditions, they rejected a boost. I'm sorry, I said that incorrectly. They rejected a booster for the general population, recommended it for people 65 and over and those with underlying health conditions. But the CDC, which the whole American public has gotten to know better, also overrode some of the recommendations and expanded the categories of those who'd be eligible for a booster shot. Tell us more about the science that led to that decision. And also from your point of view, the likelihood we'll see a change to those recommendations as more data comes in.
Well, thank you for that. We are still learning how these vaccines are protecting against COVID. They do, and they protect best, as you know, against hospitalization and mortality, even against the Delta variant and other variants. So that's the good news for your viewers, and that's why everybody should get immunized,
right,
who's eligible to be immunized. Vaccines vary in their durability. How long does that immune response last in a way that's protective? And we're still learning as a global biomedical community the duration of protection after these vaccines. But there's some data to suggest that there's some waning of immunity, and that's to be expected to some extent. The antibodies diminish over time. We think the antibodies are important for protection. There may also be T-cell immunity, cellular immunity against the virus. So we're still defining all of that, but there's some evidence that they come down, not unexpectedly, the antibodies with time. And there was some evidence from the data in the US and in Israel that with increasing time since immunization, you have increased risk of infection. Now, that's complicated to sort out because at the same time, the variants change. So was it due to the antibody coming down, or was it due to the new Delta, or some combination? That's a little hard to tease apart, but the bottom line is there was the impression, particularly in those who are older, people with weak immune systems, that a booster benefit would outweigh any risks known for the booster. As you get into younger and younger age groups, the risk of severe outcomes drops and the amount of safety data around a booster is less. So therefore, the risk benefit now didn't seem as compelling. But we are agnostic for the future. In other words, there was likely going to be more data collected, right, and the sponsors, whether it's Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, will be bringing those data to FDA, and FDA will determine when it's time for us to sit and look and say, hey, maybe it's time to go down now to lower age groups. That's perfectly possible, certainly what the state of Israel has done. Yeah.
We're speaking today with Dr. Ofer Levy, Director of Precision Vaccine Programs and the Director of Infectious Disease at Boston Children's Hospital. He serves on the FDA COVID Vaccine Advisory Committee. Dr. Levy, when the pandemic struck, there were already other vaccine studies underway based on the mRNA technology, and your team began building upon earlier work by our good friend and former guest, Dr. Peter Hotez, who had developed a vaccine to address the SARS outbreak back in 2003, which I think really set the stage for developing a COVID vaccine far more quickly. I'm wondering if you could talk to our listeners about that trajectory and why it matters when talking about how swiftly these vaccines were created. I think that's a concern on many people's minds, that somehow the vaccines happened in such a short window when in fact they happened over a long period of time.
Correct. So a lot of these are technologies that have matured over the years. You highlight the leadership from Dr. Peter Hotez and Maria Bottazzi in the group at Baylor. They had worked on the earlier version of SARS, and then, of course, as that epidemic dissipated, there was less interest and funding in moving that work forward. But their work was seminal years ago and allowed us to get out of the gate. They provided us very valuable spike protein antigen to work on. Our group here at Boston Children's Hospital, I direct the Precision Vaccines Program. We're bringing precision medicine principles to vaccinology. How do we understand the immune system varying with age, and how do we build vaccines that are tailored to a particular susceptible population? And right off the bat, we started to collaborate with Peter and others to develop a vaccine that would not require freezing, that was highly active in the elderly. And our group has a strength in adjuvants. Adjuvants are molecules that boost an immune response, from the Latin adjuvar, to help or aid. And these are like rocket fuel for the immune system. And these molecules you can add to a vaccine to get the vaccine to work better, possibly even a single shot protection, high levels of antibody. And it turns out that different age groups respond differently to these immune enhancing molecules, these adjuvants. And so we modeled human elderly responses outside the body. We had members of my synagogue in Cambridge, Eitz Chaim, come in and donate blood, older individuals, 60, 70, 80 years old at the height of the pandemic, coming in bravely and donating blood so we could test it outside the body and find the best adjuvant for that age group, and then test it in elderly mice and showed that this vaccine that we created was at least as effective as the Pfizer vaccine. And now a company is advancing a similar concept with these same adjuvants in India. I think the company is called Biological E, and they work with Peter Hotez and their group. So it's been a very powerful collaboration. We recently released our data on a public archive, bioarchive, and it's under review at a nice journal. So we're very proud of our team's work, and we thank all of our collaborators around that. This pandemic really, in many ways, brought out the best in people working together across academia, industry, and government to accelerate vaccine development. And we need those vaccines, because right now, across the globe, there's a shortage of vaccines. And in Africa, for example, only 1% to 2% of the population has been immunized. It's a moral outrage. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's more vaccine research to be done. How can we develop vaccines that give single shot protection, that are safe and effective, easy to transport? And this is really a challenge,
Well, that is both exciting and hopeful, and should inspire us all to keep working with all resources on this. Certainly one of the great frustrations in the midst of this has been addressing the issue of vaccine hesitancy or vaccine flat out resistance and an unwillingness to get the vaccine, despite all the evidence of how well vaccines work. And we have decades of history and hundreds and thousands, millions of lives across the globe that have been saved. But just recently, it seems we're making some progress, perhaps, with previously resistant populations. And I wonder what your thoughts are. It seems part of it, as we read about in New York City and other places where municipal employers or businesses are mandating it, that may be one thing that's pushing people to get the vaccine. But I'm also reading that it's really the Delta variant, that people have heard enough now about how readily transmissible the Delta variant is, how dangerous it is really to all ages, that may finally be the knowledge that is overcoming some of this resistance. What are you seeing in the data around the country, or just what you're hearing from the people that you're working with about overcoming this hesitancy and resistance? Are we making progress?
Thank you for that, Margaret. When we convene as a vaccine advisory committee, there's a public commentary phase. And together with a colleague of mine, Elisa Weitzman, we systematically analyzed all the public commentary around the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. As you might imagine, you have Americans of all points of view weighing in, pro-vax, anti-vax, in between, vaccine hesitant. And that was very instructive. We published that work recently. And now we're looking at the commentary around the booster dose meeting. As Americans learn more and more about the virus and the vaccines, attitudes evolve. I know we've made steps in the right direction. More people are coming forward to endorse immunization. I know that in a range of communities, uptake has increased, including in the African American community. We welcome that news. And yet still, there are people for a range of reasons who are vaccine hesitant or resistant. In some cases, information helps. In other cases, people have made up their mind and they have a certain stance and a certain belief. We have a large heterogeneous country with a lot of different points of view. We have a big tent here, and that's good. But we have to continue this respectful communication. The vaccines are, yes, for ourselves, our loved ones, but for our entire community, for getting our economy back on its feet, getting the schools reopened, and getting back to some semblance of normality here.
Well, we encourage everybody to talk to their physician or to someone that they trust about getting vaccinated. Dr. Levy, we were recently talking about the silver lining of this pandemic experience with your Harvard colleague, Dr. Michael Mina, and we really talked about the acceleration of the scientific discovery spurred by the urgency of the pandemic. And, the idea that we can vaccinate against emerging infectious pathogens is one thing, but the idea that the vaccines could prevent cancer or HIV, even opioid addiction, seems like futuristic fantasy. But actually, there are people like yourself who are working hard on many of these. You're doing it at the Precision Vaccine Program, along with global partners. What excites you most about the potential to improve human health with the science that's unfolding right now?
Well, as our colleague Stanley Plotkin, who's widely renowned as the godfather of vaccinology, has been doing vaccine research since the 1950s, says it is hard to overstate the beneficial impact of immunization across the globe generally. Parents used to be afraid to let their kids swim in the public pool. They were going to get polio.
Right.
When was the last time any of us were worried about that? Smallpox. People were dying of smallpox. When was the last time when you traveled anywhere you were worried about that? Vaccines are a victim of their own success. And we need to realize that. So yes, each new vaccine has to be scrutinized for safety. We have to have the process we talked about. But in the big picture, other than clean drinking water, vaccines are by far the most important biomedical intervention known to humans. And this in many ways is ushering in a new golden era of immunization, where we can develop vaccines that are more precise, that are safer, more effective, and against a range of indications. Infectious diseases, yes, we need better influenza vaccines, vaccine against HIV. We're working in collaboration with the HIV Vaccine Trials Network on that, and also against opioid overdose, such as fentanyl. Over 100 Americans a day are dying of opioid overdose. The coronavirus pandemic has worsened the opioid epidemic, and we are funded by NIH, NIAID to develop a vaccine that would induce antibodies against fentanyl. This would be a vaccine given to people who have substance use disorder, not to the general population, but they're at risk in a moment of weakness taking a street drug that might be cut with fentanyl and overdosing. But if they're immunized, they have antibodies in their blood, it binds the fentanyl, doesn't let it get to the brain where it suppresses respiration and causes death. It's a multi-year project that will culminate in a phase 1 clinical trial. David Dowling of the Precision Vaccines Program and I are the PIs, and we collaborate with my wife, Dr. Sharon Levy, who directs the substance use program here at Boston Children's. Very multidisciplinary work, and we are enthused and excited by the potential of these vaccines.
Let me just try to get one last in here. We're watching the FDA authorization for Moderna vaccine, J&J, as they're going to be coming through. I think a lot of people want to know, can they mix these booster shots, such as J&J recipient a booster of Moderna or Pfizer? I know it may be that hasn't fully been vetted yet, but what's your sense of what we might see down the road, and or of any clinical trials that you know are going on about blending vaccines?
Yeah, thank you for that. Hypothetically, it might be very good. You might have additional boosting of immunity, but we need data. So as you intimate, we welcome the studies that are ongoing, and there are some studies looking at that, and we look forward to the data. But it is an interesting concept. It may be helpful. I also want to add another thing, and this might not have come across in some of the other discussions. It is not that we had any concerning safety signal about the boosters. It was just the absence of general data. We wanted to see more data. It's not like we saw a bad signal. I just want the public to be aware of that.
And maybe just for the public, the size of clinical trials probably vary, but I think people are worried about the size of those clinical trials for the 5 to 11-year-olds, and then certainly from birth to 4. How big do those need to be? Because the public may not understand the complication of registering people for clinical trials and setting that up. What is the standard size, or is there one for building confidence?
Thank you, Mark. This is a very good question. It's a question of power, of statistical power, and that relates to what are the main endpoints of the study, right? And if the endpoint is the basic safety parameters and the ability to induce an antibody response that we think is protective, it's possible that a couple of thousand individuals may be sufficient. It also depends a little bit on how big the differences we detect are, right? So I can't prejudge the data. On the other hand, if one is trying to detect less common events, one might need a larger study. So again, I haven't seen the study design or any of the data, so I want to suspend any comments, but those are some general principles. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much.
We've been speaking today with Dr. Ofer Levy, Director of the Precision Vaccines Program at Boston Children's Hospital, and he also serves on the FDA COVID Vaccine Advisory Panel. Learn more about his exciting work by going to childrenshospital.org/researchers/Ofer Levy, or follow him on Twitter @Levy_O or @PREC Vaccines. Dr. Levy, we thank you for your curiosity, your tenacious commitment to uncovering the secrets of immunity, and for joining us today on Conversations on Healthcare.
Take care, and thank you, Mark and Margaret. Take care.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.